The morning Mae Townsend fired a warning shot over the head of her seventh suitor. The whole town of Caldwell, Kansas, decided collectively that she had gone past grieving and moved straight into permanent solitude, and not a soul could honestly say they blamed her. It was the spring of 1884, and the dust that rolled through the streets of Caldwell was the same color as the dry grief that had settled into Mae's bones 7 years prior, when Thomas Townsend had ridden out to check the south fence line on a Tuesday afternoon and never come back. His horse had returned alone by nightfall, its saddle empty and one stirrup broken loose, and Mae had sat on the porch of their homestead with a lantern in her hand until the sky went pink again the following morning. They found Thomas 2 days later at the bottom of a limestone ravine, thrown from the saddle when a rattlesnake startled the mare beneath him. He was 31 years old. Mae was 24. They had been married 4 years and had a daughter together, a small, fierce girl named Clara who had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness in equal measure. The farm was 30 acres of decent bottomland along Bluff Creek, good for wheat and a modest cattle operation, and Mae had kept every inch of it alive through willpower and sheer refusal to accept that the land could beat her. She hired 2 hands when she could afford it. She did the rest herself. She learned to fix fences and bleed boilers, and read weather in the clouds the way Thomas had done, and she did all of it with Clara riding on her hip until Clara was old enough to walk alongside her. The suitors came because the land was valuable, and because Mae, even in her grief and her self-imposed isolation, was a woman who stopped a man's thinking when she walked into a room. She was tall for a woman of her time, with dark red hair that she kept pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat through the working hours, and let fall loose in thick waves around her shoulders in the evenings. Her eyes were a gray-green color that shifted with the light, and her hands were calloused and capable, and the combination of her beauty and her competence and her land was apparently irresistible to a particular kind of man who believed that a widow's grief was simply a negotiation that hadn't been finalized yet. The first suitor arrived 14 months after Thomas died. His name was Edgar Prout, and he was a banker's son from Wichita who had heard about the Townsend farm from a land agent who had no business discussing Mae's affairs with anyone. Edgar arrived in a good suit and a rented buggy, and informed me over her own front porch railing that he would be willing to assume management of the property if she would agree to a reasonable arrangement. Mae had looked at him for a long moment with those gray-green eyes, and then she had told him to get off her land and not come back, and she had used words that made Edgar's face go the color of a beet before he climbed back into his buggy and drove away too fast. The second came a year after that. Then the third, then the fourth and fifth in the same calendar year, which had been particularly trying. There was a cattle rancher from Sumner County who sent his foreman ahead as a kind of advance scouting party. There was a widower from Medicine Lodge who brought flowers and then spent 40 minutes explaining how much better Mae's wheat operation could run under his direction. There was a young man of 22 who Mae suspected had been put up to it on a bet. Because he turned crimson from the collar up the moment she opened the door and barely managed to speak his purpose before she closed it again. There was the lawman, Deputy Hicks, who was a decent enough person and who she almost felt bad about, but who had made the critical error of suggesting that Clara needed a father figure, as if Mae's daughter were a problem in need of a solution rather than the most complete and capable small human Mae had ever encountered. By the 7th, Mae had developed a system. She no longer answered the door with hope or curiosity. She answered it with the full knowledge of what was coming, and the patience of a woman who had long since run out of the softer kind. When Harlan Beasley arrived in the autumn of 1883 and presented himself on her porch with his hat in his hands and his intentions transparent as glass, Mae had walked back inside, retrieved her rifle from above the fireplace, stepped back onto the porch, aimed at a fence post 20 feet beyond Harlan's left ear, and fired. Harlan had cleared his horse in a manner that defied description, and been a quarter-mile down the road before the echo of the shot finished rolling across the hills. After that, the suitors stopped coming, and Caldwell gave Mae Townsend a wide, respectful berth, and the town collectively moved on to other gossip. Clara was 11 by then, growing fast and curious about everything, with a habit of asking questions that Mae didn't always have answers for, and a talent for drawing that she practiced in the margins of her school primers and on the backs of flour sacks when she thought her mother wasn't watching. Mae encouraged the drawing and pretended not to notice the flour sacks. They had a good life together, the two of them. It was quiet and it was real and it belonged entirely to them, and Mae had made her peace with the shape of it. What she had not made peace with, though she would not have said so aloud, was the loneliness that came after Clara went to bed. The particular quality of silence in a house where there was only one adult set of ears to hear the wind and the creek, and the small sounds that a homestead made at night. She had Thomas's memory, and she had her work, and she had her daughter, and she told herself this was enough, and most days she believed it. Joel Garrett rode into Caldwell on a Wednesday in late April of 1884 on a sorrel horse that had seen better days, and so, frankly, had he. He was not a large man in the way that the word large implied dominance. He was lean and broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had done physical work for a long time, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that was a little too long, and a jaw that hadn't met a razor in perhaps 4 days. He wore a plain brown duster and trail-worn boots, and a hat that had been a good hat once, perhaps 5 years ago, and he carried a worn leather saddlebag over one shoulder and a carpenter's toolbox strapped behind his saddle. He was 33 years old, though he looked as though the past year had added something beyond the calendar to his face, a certain settled quietness around the eyes that came not from age but from something harder to name. He was not, as it would become important to establish, there for Mae Townsend. He was not there for anyone in particular. He was a carpenter and builder by trade who had spent the better part of the last decade following construction work across Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, and the Texas Panhandle. And he was in Caldwell because he had heard through the informal network of men who moved between towns for work that the new grain elevator going up on the south end of town needed finished carpentry, and he needed a job. He took a room at Hendrick's boarding house, stabled his horse, ate a meal at the hotel dining room, and went to bed at a reasonable hour like a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. The next morning he introduced himself to Amos Whitfield, who was overseeing the elevator construction, and was hired on the spot because Amos had been trying to find a man who knew finish work for 3 weeks, and the job was already behind schedule. Joel shook Amos's hand, pulled on his work gloves, and went to it. He had been in town for 6 days before he heard Mae Townsend's name, and even then it was not in the context he might have expected. He was having his morning coffee at the counter of Drummond's General Store when 2 men came in talking about the Townsend fence line. A section of the northern boundary of Mae's property had apparently come down in the spring flood, and her cattle had wandered onto the neighboring Dolly land. And old Pete Dolly was making a fuss about it in the way that Pete Dolly made a fuss about everything, which was loudly and with self-righteous persistence. The 2 men at the counter were debating whether Mae would hire someone to fix it or try to do it herself, and the tone they used when discussing her was the particular combination of admiration and nervous uncertainty that Caldwell had developed specifically for Mae Townsend. "She'll do it herself," one of the men said. "Stubborn as a post, always has been." "The woman needs help," the other said, and then added quickly, "but good luck telling her that." Joel finished his coffee and went back to the elevator. He did not think much more about it. What actually brought him to Mae Townsend's property 4 days later had nothing to do with fence lines or romantic interest, and everything to do with a young girl's drawing and a broken axle on a supply wagon. He had been driving one of the construction company's supply wagons out toward the creek to retrieve a load of gravel when the rear axle cracked on a hidden rock in the road, and dropped the wagon bed at a sharp angle that sent half the load sliding. He was close enough to the Townsend farm that he could see the house from where he stood in the road, and he had been standing there assessing the damage when a girl came running across the field toward him at a speed that suggested alarm rather than idle curiosity. She was small and dark-eyed and completely unafraid of anything, and she arrived at the wagon and immediately began examining the axle with the focused attention of someone who found mechanical problems genuinely interesting. "That's cracked clean through," she announced. "You'll need a new one. Did you hit the rock by the old cottonwood? Everybody hits that rock." "Apparently I'm everybody," Joel said. The girl looked up at him with those serious dark eyes. "I'm Clara Townsend. That's our farm." She pointed toward the house without taking her eyes off the axle. "My mother might have a spare axle pin in the barn. We keep parts because our equipment breaks a lot. Come on." She was already walking back toward the farm before he had finished deciding whether to follow her, and Joel, who did not have many other options given that the wagon was thoroughly stuck, tied his horse to a fence post and followed. The barn was well organized for a working farm, which Joel noted with professional respect. Tools hung on proper pegs, not dumped in piles. The workbench was clear and functional. The spare parts were kept in a wooden bin that was labeled in a neat hand. He was looking through the bin when he became aware that someone was standing in the barn doorway and had been for approximately 30 seconds without announcing themselves. He turned around. Mae Townsend was not what he had expected, though he could not have explained precisely what he had expected, given that he had not thought about her enough to form an expectation. She was tall and she was looking at him with those gray-green eyes, and her expression was the expression of a woman who had found a stranger in her barn and had not yet decided what to do about it. "I'm Joel Garrett," he said. "Your daughter invited me. My supply wagon's axle broke on the county road, and she thought you might have a replacement part. I'm with the Whitfield construction crew." Mae looked at him for another moment and then looked at Clara, who was standing behind Joel with the expression of someone who was confident they had done the right thing and was prepared to defend this position. "You always bring strangers into the barn, Clara." "He wasn't a stranger after I talked to him for 2 minutes," Clara said reasonably. "He's a carpenter. He knows what he's doing. Look, he already found the axle pins." Mae's gaze moved back to Joel, who had, in fact, found 2 viable axle pins in the spare parts bin and was holding them up so she could see he hadn't been rummaging unnecessarily. She stepped into the barn properly and examined the pins with the eye of someone who knew what she was looking at. "The smaller one will fit a standard freight wagon if the axle housing hasn't bent," she said. "I don't think it's bent, just the pin sheared." He paused. "I'd like to pay for it or replace it when I can get one from the hardware store." "I don't need payment for a borrowed part," Mae said. Her voice was even and direct. It was the voice of a woman who had been managing her own affairs for long enough that the management was entirely natural to her. "I'd still like to replace it," Joel said. "It's your spare. You'll need it when your equipment breaks again." There was a brief silence in which Mae seemed to be recalibrating something. People did not typically push back on her generosity in the direction of more generosity. Usually they just took and said thank you and left. "Fine," she said. "Bring a replacement when you're done with it." Joel nodded, took the pin, thanked her, and left. Clara waved at him from the barn door. Mae stood in the barn and listened to his footsteps going across the yard, and tried to identify why that particular exchange had felt different from the general run of interactions she had with people in Caldwell, and could not immediately put her finger on it. He came back 4 days later, as he'd said he would, with a new axle pin and a small bundle of carved wooden pieces that he set on the porch railing without ceremony before he knocked on the door. When Mae opened it, he held out the pin. "Replacement," he said, "and those are for your daughter. She was drawing horses in the dirt while she was waiting for me to fix the wagon, and she mentioned she likes animals. I had some scrap cedar and a free evening." Mae looked at the porch railing. The carved pieces were small horses, 3 of them, rough-hewn but recognizable and charming in their simplicity, each one in a different posture. One running, one standing with its head down, grazing, one rearing slightly as if startled. She looked back at Joel, who was waiting with the neutral patience of someone who had delivered a thing and was not attaching any particular weight to its receipt. "That was thoughtful," she said, and her voice was slightly less even than usual because she had not been expecting it. "She was good company while I fixed the wagon," Joel said simply. "She asks good questions." He handed her the axle pin, touched the brim of his hat, and walked back down to the road where his horse was waiting. Me stood in the doorway with the pin in one hand and watched him go, and there was something in the watching that she did not examine closely because she was not in the habit of examining such things. Clara came home from school 2 hours later and found the horses on the porch railing, and let out a sound of pure delight that brought me out from the kitchen to see what had happened. She explained where they had come from. Clara held all 3 horses with tremendous care, and asked with enormous seriousness if she could keep them on the windowsill in her room, and me said yes, and that was that. Except it was not entirely that, because Clara began mentioning Joel Garrett with the casual frequency of someone who had decided, with the practical certainty that 11-year-olds bring to such decisions, that he was a person worth knowing. She had apparently stopped by the construction site on her way home from school twice since the wagon incident, which me had not known about. Joel had apparently shown her how to properly set a square when framing a joint. She had apparently found this fascinating. "He said the angle has to be exactly 90 degrees or the whole structure is off," Clara informed her mother at dinner one evening. "He said most people rush it and then wonder why things wobble." Me served herself more beans and said nothing. "He has a nice horse," Clara added. "She's a sorrel named Pepper. He lets me give her carrots." "Clara," me said, "I'm just telling you about my day. You're telling me about a man." Clara looked at her mother across the dinner table with those dark, serious eyes. "He doesn't act like the others," she said. This stopped me in a way she had not expected. Because Clara had been 4 years old when Thomas died and had no real memory of her father, and had grown up in the shadow of me's quiet refusals, and had formed her own quiet opinions about the men who came and the way her mother sent them away. And she was 11 now, old enough to observe and form impressions, and she was not a girl who said things without meaning them. Me looked at her daughter for a moment. "What do you mean?" she asked, and she meant it as a real question. Clara thought about it. "He doesn't look at the farm," she said finally. "When the others came, they always looked at the farm. He just looks at what he's working on and at you, but not like he's calculating something, like he's just looking." Me set down her fork and was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Eat your beans," and Clara ate her beans and did not press the matter because she was a remarkably perceptive child who understood when to let things settle. Joel did not come back to the farm again for another 2 weeks, and when he did, it was at the request of Amos Whitfield, not of his own invention. Whitfield had taken on a side contract to repair the schoolhouse roof, which was badly needed, and he had sent 2 of his crew out to do it, but one of the men had broken a wrist falling from his horse the previous day, leaving the crew short. Whitfield had asked Joel to fill in for the afternoon. Mae Townsend was on the schoolhouse grounds when Joel arrived because she was a member of the school board and had been overseeing the roof repairs on behalf of the board. And this was the first time she had known that the carpenter who had fixed his wagon on her road and carved horses for her daughter was the same Joel Garrett that Amos Whitfield had been discussing for the past several weeks as his best worker. She was standing in the schoolyard with a list in her hand, and she looked up when he climbed down from the Whitfield wagon, and she registered a particular small surprise that she kept off her face through practice. "Mr. Garrett," she said. "Mrs. Townsend," he said. He looked up at the roof. "Whitfield said the east section needs new shingles and there's a rafter that's gone soft." "That's right. The rafter is in the 3rd section from the ridge on the east side. You'll see where the sheathing has gone dark." He nodded and went to get his tools from the wagon, and me went back to her list. and they worked in the same general proximity for the better part of 3 hours, with a comfortable distance between them that felt less like avoidance, and more like the natural working relationship of two people who each knew their own job. At one point, Mee brought water up to the men on the roof, and Joel thanked her and drank and handed the cup back and asked if she wanted him to check the west section as well while he was up there, because from the ridge he could see some of the west shingles had lifted in the last windstorm. "If you have the time," she said. "I have the time," he said, and went back to work. She noticed that he worked without waste motion, that he didn't talk unnecessarily, that when he found the soft rafter he called down to her to confirm the extent of the damage before he did anything about it, which was the action of someone who understood that the decision was hers to make, not his. She noticed these things in the way she noticed things, which was carefully and without immediate conclusion. The roof took the rest of the day and part of the next morning. When it was done, Joel and the remaining crew member loaded their tools, and Amos Whitfield came to inspect the work and pronounced it solid, and Mae Townsend signed off on behalf of the board and shook Amos's hand. She turned to go and then turned back and said, "Mr. Garrett, the carving you left for my daughter. She carries one of them in her pocket to school, the running one." Joel looked quietly pleased in a way that he didn't perform or advertise. "She mentioned she liked the running horses best," he said. "She did," Mee said. "Thank you." She walked away, and Joel watched her go for a moment and then went back to loading the wagon, and neither of them said anything more about it. The elevator construction was running 4 weeks behind schedule due to material delays and the broken wrist situation, and 2 days of hard rain, which meant Joel's contract with Whitfield was extended through the end of July. And so, he remained in Caldwell and remained in the general orbit of Mae Townsend's life in the small overlapping ways that a town of moderate size permits. He saw her at Drummond's store on 2 occasions, once buying seed and once buying a bolt of cloth, and both times they exchanged a brief civil acknowledgement and nothing more. He saw her at the Independence Day gathering in the town square, where the whole of Caldwell turned out to eat, and to hear a patriotic speech from Mayor Denning that ran 17 minutes longer than necessary. Mee was there with Clara and with her neighbor Bess Holloway, and Joel was there eating a ham sandwich and watching the fireworks from the edge of the square, and they were on different sides of the crowd. Clara saw Joel from 30 feet away and waved at him with great enthusiasm, and then said something to her mother. Mee turned and looked across the crowd at him, and he tipped his hat, and she gave a small nod that was not unfriendly. Bess Holloway, who was 48 years old and had been Mee's neighbor and closest friend for all 7 years of her widowhood, leaned over and said something in Mee's ear that made Mee's expression go the precise calibrated neutral that she reserved for things she did not intend to discuss. "Don't," Mee said. "I'm not doing anything," Bess said, which was technically true. "You were about to." "I was merely going to observe that he is, Bess." Bess ate her corn bread and said nothing further, but she watched Joel Garrett across the square with the focused assessment of a woman who had been waiting 7 years for something to be worth observing. The thing that brought Joel back to Mee's farm was not a broken piece of equipment or a school board obligation or anything else that could have been described as pretext. It was a storm. The storm came up on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of July, faster than the clouds had suggested it would, and it was the kind of Kansas summer storm that meant business, the kind that bent the cottonwood trees horizontal and turned the creek into a roaring brown force that jumped its banks and ate the low ground. Joel had been walking back from the construction site when the storm hit, and he had taken shelter in a horse barn at the edge of town that belonged to Pete Dolly, and waited out the worst of it, watching the lightning step across the prairie in long white strides. When it cleared, he walked out onto the road and looked south toward the creek and saw, in the thin yellow light that follows a storm like a pale afterthought, that the water was already spreading across the lowland in wide dark sheets. He knew from 6 weeks in Caldwell that the Townsend farm was on the bottomland. He knew the fence line had come down earlier in the spring. He thought about the barn and the cattle and the wheat that was 3 weeks from harvest. He was at the livery, getting Pepper saddled before he had finished the thought. He arrived at the Townsend farm 40 minutes after the storm ended and found exactly what he had suspected. The creek had come up over the lower fence and taken out a second section, and 6 head of cattle had moved through the gap and were standing in the low-water margin looking confused, and there was water standing 6 inches deep in the southwest corner of the wheat field. Mae was already in the field in her work boots with her skirt hitched up and a coil of fence wire over her shoulder, and Clara was with her holding a lantern, and together they were working in the dark and the mud trying to run a temporary line before the cattle wandered further. Joel dismounted and walked to the gap in the fence without being invited, and Mae looked up at him with the lantern light making angles on her face. "Mr. Garrett," she said, and her voice was the voice of a woman who was too busy to be either surprised or resistant. "What do you need first, the cattle or the fence?" "The cattle are mostly together," she said. "The west gap is the problem. The wire's tangled in the willows and I can't get enough tension to make it hold." "I can get the tension," he said. "Where's your fence stretcher?" "Barn, second hook on the right side of the door." He got the stretcher and came back and worked the wire through the willow tangle and got it to the post, and set it with more force than Mae had been able to bring to bear, and the line held. He ran 2 more strands above it while Mae and Clara moved the cattle back through the proper gate opening. It took the better part of 2 hours. When they were done, all 3 of them were covered in creek mud, and considerably wetter than the situation strictly required. They stood outside the barn in the dark in the particular quiet that follows a storm and a long physical effort, and Mae was breathing with the deep, even breath of someone who has worked hard and finished the work, and Joel was wiping his hands on a rag that was already beyond redemption, and Clara was examining the mud on her boots with philosophical acceptance. "Come inside," Mae said to Joel. "I'll put coffee on." He looked at her. "It's coffee," she said, "not an invitation to anything else. You helped and you're covered in my creek mud and it's past 10 at night. Come inside." Joel came inside. The kitchen was warm and well-ordered and smelled of beeswax and dried herbs, and Mae put the coffee on and Clara went to wash up, and Joel stood at the kitchen sink and washed the worst of the mud from his hands and forearms and tried to be as little of an imposition as possible. Mae brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from where he stood at the sink, and waited. He dried his hands and came to the table and sat down, and they drank coffee in the kitchen at 10:30 in the evening, with the storm-washed night outside the window and the lamp burning low on the table, and it was the most comfortable Joel Garrett had felt in a room with another person in what he later calculated was the better part of a year. He had not intended to say anything personal. He was not the kind of man who said personal things uninvited. But Mae looked at him across the table with those gray-green eyes and asked, with the directness that was her natural mode, "You're not from Kansas, are you?" "Oklahoma Territory," he said, "originally. I've been moving around for work for about 10 years. Where's home now?" He thought about this with the honesty it deserved. "Wherever the work is, I suppose." Mae turned her coffee cup in her hands and said, "That's a lonely way to be." It was so straightforwardly true and delivered with such complete lack of performance that Joel sat with it for a moment before answering. "Yes," he said, "it is." Clara came back into the kitchen in a clean dress with her hair in a loose braid, and accepted a cup of warm milk from her mother and sat at the table, and looked at Joel with the expression she used when she was running a calculation. "Are you going to keep working on the elevator?" she asked. "Until it's done," he said. "Another few weeks." "And then?" "Clara," Mae said, mild. "I'm just asking," Clara said. Joel looked at the girl across the table. "Then I'll look for the next job," he said honestly. Clara appeared to consider this. "That doesn't seem like a very good system," she said. "Clara," Mae said again, but there was something in her voice that was less corrective and more like the effort of not smiling. "I'm inclined to agree with you," Joel said to Clara. "But it's been my system for a while, and I haven't come up with a better one yet." Clara looked at him, and then at her mother, and then back at him. And then she picked up her milk and drank it with great dignity and said nothing more on the subject. They sat until the coffee was gone and the hour was genuinely late, and then Joel stood and thanked me for the coffee, and she walked him to the door. He took his hat from the peg by the door and put it on, and she stood in the doorway with the lamplight behind her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "The fence will hold until morning," he said finally. "But you should get someone to look at the post on the far west end. It's rotated about 3 inches off plumb from the water pressure. Won't be long before it goes again." "I'll look at it tomorrow," she said. He stopped himself. "I'll be at the site tomorrow." "Yes," she said. "And then, Mr. Garrett, what you did tonight, coming out here, you didn't have to do that." He looked at her. "I know," he said. He rode back to town in the clean after-storm air under a sky that had cleared to show every star in the Kansas catalog, and he was not thinking about the next job. He was thinking about gray-green eyes and a kitchen lamp, and a small, serious girl who had told him his life system wasn't very good, and the fact that she was absolutely right. The post on the west fence was still listing the next morning, and when Joel arrived at it that Saturday carrying a post-hole digger and a replacement post on the back of his horse, Mae was already there with a shovel, and they looked at each other with the expression of two people who have each arrived somewhere expecting to work alone and found the other there first. There was a pause. "I thought you were at the construction site," Mae said. "It's Saturday. No work on Saturday." He looked at the post. "I brought a replacement." Mae looked at the post he had brought, which was the correct diameter and appropriately treated against rot, and she looked at him, and she made a decision that she did not announce because announcing decisions was not her way. "I'll dig the hole," she said. "You can set the post." They worked together through the morning in a comfortable rhythm that seemed, to both of them, remarkable primarily in how unremarkable it felt. They did not have to negotiate the division of the work, because the work organized itself logically between two capable people who each understood what needed doing. He dug with efficient strokes and Joel set the post with the level precision of someone who did not rush that part, and then they ran the wire and he made sure the tension was consistent along the full replaced section. When they were done, Mae stood back and looked at the fence line and said, "That's good work." "You set a clean hole," he said. "My husband taught me," she said, not sadly. Just factually, the way she had learned to say Thomas-related things as information rather than grief. Joel nodded. He did not offer condolences that were 7 years too late or fill the silence with the awkward scramble of someone who didn't know what to do with a widow's casual mention of her dead husband. He just nodded and began coiling the extra wire. Mae watched him coil the wire, and she noticed again what Clara had noticed, which was that he did not calculate. He simply was in the space he occupied without agenda or performance. "There's food at the house," she said, "if you want, for your trouble." "I'm not in trouble," he said, "for your help then." He finished coiling the wire and tied it neatly. "I wouldn't say no to food," he said. They ate lunch at the kitchen table, the three of them, because Clara had come home from her friend Annabelle's house and found a man at the lunch table and had seated herself with complete composure, and proceeded to eat and to conduct a conversation about horses and carpentry, and what the Oklahoma Territory was like that lasted through the entire meal and well into the afternoon. Joel answered every question with the same patient directness he brought to everything, and if he was charmed by Clara's thoroughness, he showed it in the slight relaxation of his expression rather than in any performance of it. Mae ate and listened and watched the two of them and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. After lunch, Clara showed Joel her drawings, the ones she kept in the cigar box under her bed that she showed only to people she trusted completely, and Joel looked at each one with genuine attention. There were horses and barns and prairie landscapes and careful detailed drawings of hands holding tools and one intricate drawing of the kitchen window with the light coming through it. "This one," Joel said, holding up the window drawing. "This is very good." Clara beamed with a brightness that could have lit the room. "That's my favorite one," she said. "You've got an eye for light." he said. "That's hard to learn. Most people either have it or they don't." Clara looked at the drawing and then at him, and then back at the drawing with new appreciation for what she had apparently managed without knowing she was doing it. Mae saw her daughter's confidence settle into something more permanent than a compliment could have produced, because Joel had named the thing and therefore made it real. That evening, after Joel had gone, Clara came and stood beside me at the kitchen sink where Mae was washing the dishes, and she said, with the tone of someone stating a simple fact, "I like him." "I know you do," Mae said. "Do you?" Mae dried a plate. "I don't dislike him." Clara considered this for a moment. "That's more than the others ever got," she observed, and went to bed. Mae stood at the kitchen sink for a while after Clara's light went out, looking out the window at the dark summer prairie and the stars, and she thought about what it meant to not dislike someone, to find their presence in a room easy rather than effortful, to work alongside them without the friction of negotiating territory or expectation. She had not felt easy with a person outside of Bess Holloway and her daughter since Thomas died. She was not, she told herself, going to read more into it than that. Joel Garrett was a carpenter with a habit of being useful and a good way with her daughter, and he would finish his contract with Whitfield and move on to the next job in the next town, because that was the system he had described, and she had no reason to expect anything different. She washed the last dish and dried her hands and went to bed, and tried to believe what she had told herself. The thing she did not anticipate was that Joel Garrett was also thinking, and had been for some weeks, about the system he had described. He had come to Caldwell with nothing more in mind than a job and enough money to move on to the next one, which had been his mode for 10 years following a life in the Oklahoma Territory that had ended badly in ways that had nothing to do with anything he was willing to discuss in detail and everything to do with loss. He had had a wife, once. Her name had been Anna, and she had died in the cholera outbreak of 1877, along with their infant son. And Joel had dealt with this loss the way certain men deal with unbearable things, which was by putting it somewhere he could not fully reach and moving, always moving, because the forward motion kept the grief behind him rather than beneath his feet. He had built things in a dozen towns across 3 territories, and he had been good at the work, and he had kept to himself, and it had been sufficient. He had not looked for anything else because looking implied an expectation of finding, and he had learned not to expect. But something about the flat openness of the Kansas summer and the quality of the light on the prairie at the end of the working day, and the particular combination of Mae Townsend's capable hands and her honest eyes and the way she had said, with such simple directness, that his system was a lonely way to be, was working on him in a manner he could not easily dismiss. He had not come to her farm with any intention. He had come because of a cracked axle and a storm and an unlevel fence post, and none of those things were pretexts. They were just the accidents of proximity and circumstance that occasionally altered the direction of a life without announcing that that was what they were doing. He was still working on the elevator, which was nearing completion. He had perhaps 3 weeks left on the Whitfield contract. He thought about Oklahoma Territory and the other towns he had worked in, and he thought about what was waiting for him in any of them, which was another job and another boarding house room and another town where he knew nobody and nobody knew him. He did not romanticize Mae Townsend's situation. He understood that she had kept her own world ordered and intact through considerable effort, and that she had no reason to want anything from him, and every reason to be wary of the men who came to her door with calculations in their eyes. He was not going to be another man on her porch with calculations. But he also understood, with the clarity of someone who had been entirely honest with himself about his own loneliness for long enough, that what he wanted was not the farm or the land or anything that could be weighed and measured. What he wanted was to be in the same room as her and have it feel the way it had felt at the kitchen table with the storm-washed night outside and the lamp burning low, which was like something he had given up expecting and then found anyway, the way you find a thing when you've stopped looking for it. He did not know what to do with this information. He had not been a suitor in any of his visits. He had fixed things and delivered things and answered a curious child's questions, and that was all. He told himself he should finish the contract and move on, and let the feeling go to wherever feelings went when you chose reason over them. He told himself this for approximately 1 week, which was how long it took before he found himself riding back out to the Townsend farm on a Saturday morning with no excuse whatsoever. He had a box of cedar scraps from the construction site, which he thought Clara might like for drawing charcoal or just for the material itself, and this was real and not fabricated, but he was aware it was also thin as pretexts went. He rode out to the farm anyway. Mae was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds when he came down the road, and she stood and looked at him with an expression that was curious and guarded in equal parts, and he dismounted and held up the box of cedar. "For Clara," he said. "Cedar charcoal for her drawing. I thought she might want it." Mae looked at the box and then at him. "She's at school," she said. "Right," Joel said, and then, with the honesty that was his natural mode when he was not trying to manage himself, "I knew that." There was a pause. "You came anyway," Mae said. "I came anyway," he agreed. Mae looked at him for a long moment in the morning sun, standing in her garden with dirt on her gloves and her hair pinned back under her hat, and she said, "That's the most honest thing any man has said on this property in 7 years. I'm not here about the farm," he said. "I want to say that plainly because I understand there have been men who were here about the farm, and I'm not one of them." "I know you're not," she said, and the certainty in her voice told him she had known it for some time. "I'm not sure what I am here about," he said. "Or I know, but I don't want to say it wrong." Mae pulled off her garden gloves and looked at him with the full attention of those gray-green eyes, the kind of attention that was entirely honest and would receive honesty in kind. "Then say it the way you mean it," she said. He took his hat off and held it in his hands. "I would like to spend more time with you," he said. "Not because of the farm or because of anything I want from you. Just because I like who you are and I feel more like myself in a room with you than I have in a very long time, and I don't have a name for that beyond the plain truth of it." Mae stood in her garden in the morning quiet and heard every word of that and felt each one land with the weight of something real. She was quiet for a long moment. Joel waited without filling the silence, which she noted. "I have sent men away from this property 7 times, she said finally. "Not because I have no heart left, but because they came for the wrong things and they would have given me less than I already had. I have been very clear-eyed about what I need and what I don't." "That seems right," he said. "I am not a woman who needs to be managed or cared for or told what to do with my land. I know that. And I am not willing to let anyone into this life who would make it smaller," she said. "My daughter is here. Everything I have built is here." "I understand," he said. "What I am saying," Mae said, and her voice was still even, but there was something in it that had not been there a moment ago, something open, "is that if you want to spend time here, I am not going to tell you to leave." Joel looked at her. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." Mae looked at him for one more moment, and then she said, "I have 3 rows of weeding left. If you want to be useful, there are gloves on the fence post." He got the gloves and knelt in the garden beside her, and they pulled weeds in the Saturday morning sun and talked about nothing in particular and everything in general, about the wheat harvest coming up and the way the summer had been dry in July, and then generous in the creek flood, about the construction of the elevator and the techniques for gravel setting, and the way Oklahoma Territory was different from Kansas in the quality of the sky. They talked the way people talk when they have established that they are willing to know each other, and the knowing is just beginning. When Clara came home from school and found Joel Garrett in the kitchen garden with her mother, she did not say anything at all, which was so unlike her that Mae looked at her sharply. Clara's expression was one of complete and private satisfaction. She accepted the box of cedar charcoal with genuine delight, examined a piece, and then went inside to do her school lessons with the dignity of someone who had been entirely right about something and had chosen not to say so. The weeks that followed were the weeks that built the thing, which is to say they were the ordinary weeks of an ordinary Kansas summer during which two people who had each been alone for a long time learned what it meant to choose someone's company freely and without price. Joel finished his contract with Whitfield at the end of July. The elevator was complete, solid and plumb and excellent work by any measure, and Amos Whitfield shook his hand and paid him fairly and told him he had work whenever there was work to be had. Joel thanked him and went back to Hendrick's boarding house and sat on the edge of his bed with his saddlebag on the floor and thought about the next job. There was work in Newton. There was work down in the Oklahoma Territory if he wanted it. He had a letter from a builder in Dodge City who was putting up 3 commercial buildings and needed a framing and finish crew. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. Then he went to see me. She was on the porch when he came down the road as if she had expected him, which she perhaps had. Clara was inside. The evening was warm and clear, and the wheat field had that golden end-of-summer quality that made the Kansas plains look, briefly, like something out of a picture. He dismounted and came up to the porch and stood at the foot of the steps, and me looked at him and waited. "The elevator is done," he said. "I know, I saw Amos at the store yesterday. I have work in Newton, Dodge City too if I want it." He paused. "I don't want it." Me looked at him steadily. "What do you want?" she asked, and the question was entirely genuine and entirely open. "I want to stay," he said. "Not here on this farm, not like that. I have money saved and I can rent land or set up on my own account. There's building work enough in Caldwell to support a man with a craft." I looked into it. He stopped. "I'm not asking you for anything. I just want you to know that I'm choosing to stay, and the reason is you, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Me was quiet for a moment, and then she stood and came down the porch steps until she was standing at the bottom step with the level of the ground where he stood, which put her nearly at his height, and she looked at him with those gray-green eyes at close range with nothing of the guarded quality that had been in them the first times he had seen her. "Then stay," she said. It was not a declaration or a negotiation or a promise. It was just the word said plainly, the way Mae Townsend said all the things she meant. He stayed. He rented a small house on the edge of town and set himself up as an independent carpenter and builder, and he had work within a week because Caldwell was a growing town and good craftsmen were always needed, and within a month he had more work than he could easily schedule. He was good at what he did, and he was reliable and he did not overcharge, and the town took to him the way towns take to a man who does what he says he will and does it well. He came to the Townsend farm on Saturdays and sometimes on Sundays, and me cooked dinner and they sat at the table together, the 3 of them, and talked and were quiet and read in the evenings while Clara drew, and none of it was grand or dramatic and all of it was real. Bess Holloway came to tea on a Tuesday in late August and watched me's face while she talked about Joel with the specific attention of a woman who has been a close friend for 7 years and knows the landscape of another person's countenance as well as she knows her own. "You look different," Bess said, when me had been talking for a while about the kitchen garden and the harvest plans and the new fence posts, and at least 3 of these subjects had involved a mention of something Joel had said or done. "I look the same," me said. "You look like someone whose window has been opened in a house that was closed up for a long time," Bess said, with the decisive certainty of someone who had earned the right to say such things. Me held her teacup and looked at her friend for a moment. "It scares me," she said, and this was perhaps the most honest thing she had said to anyone in years. Bess put her hand on me's hand. "I know it does," she said. "It would scare me too. But me, you have been so careful and so good and so alone. You're allowed to let someone in. Thomas would have told you the same thing." Me looked out the window at the summer prairie, golden and immense. "I know he would have," she said. "He was that kind of man." "Yes," Bess said, "and so is this one." The harvest came in September, and it was a good one, better than the last 3 years. and Joel helped with the binding and shocking because he had asked if he could be useful and Mae had said yes. And they worked the field together for 3 days with hired help, and Clara did her school hours and then came out to help with the lighter work in the afternoons. In the evenings they were too tired to talk much, but they sat on the porch anyway and watched the stars come up over the flat dark line of the horizon. On the second evening of harvest, Mae said, without looking away from the stars, "Joel." "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something about Thomas," she said. "I don't talk about him much with people, but I want to tell you." "Tell me," he said, and she did. She told him about meeting Thomas when she was 19, at a church social in Emporia, and how he had asked her to dance with such transparent nervousness that she had said yes mostly out of sympathy, and then had fallen in love with him over the course of the following 3 dances because he was funny and kind and entirely himself. She told him about coming to Caldwell and building the farm from 40 acres of raw grass and creek clay into something that could sustain them, and how Thomas had worked without complaint and without fear, and how she had loved him for that. She told him about the last morning she had seen him, how he had kissed her on the forehead on his way out to check the fence, and she had been in the middle of making bread and had not properly looked up, and how that absence of a proper last look had stayed with her as a small particular grief inside the larger one. Joel listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like a good man." "He was the best man I had ever known," Mae said, "and I loved him completely. I want you to know that because it's true and because I think you should understand it." "I do understand it," Joel said. "And I don't want to be Thomas or to replace him or to compete with his memory. I'm not in competition with anything." Mae looked at him then, turned fully to look at him in the dark of the porch with the stars behind his head. "No," she said, "you're not." It was the first time she had looked at him that way, with the full weight of what she was feeling in her expression, rather than held back behind the careful management of it. And Joel held her gaze, and felt the thing between them become fully real in the space of that single look. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the porch railing, carefully and without urgency, and she let him hold it, and they sat like that until the night got cold and the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie sang its one long quiet note. The autumn was the season in which the feeling between them became undeniable, and also the season in which Caldwell fully registered what was happening and responded in the way small towns respond to such developments, which is to say, with a mixture of genuine goodwill and extraordinary nosiness. People noticed that Joel Garrett's horse was regularly tied at the Townsend farm on Saturdays and Sundays. People noticed that Mae Townsend had a particular quality in her face at church on Sunday mornings that had not been there in 7 years. People who had spent 7 years treating Mae with a kind of careful, respectful distance now found themselves reassessing, and Bess Holloway found herself at the center of a surprising number of conversations that began with some version of "I hear Mae Townsend is." Bess deflected all of these with the elegance of long practice. She told people it was none of their business, and then told me everything they had said, and Mae shook her head and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not mind as much as she expected. "Let them talk," she told Bess in October over the kitchen table. Bess stared at her with open delight. "Mae Townsend just said let them talk," she announced to the empty kitchen. "Mark this day." "Don't be ridiculous," Mae said, but there was color in her cheeks and she was not entirely successful at keeping the smile from her mouth. The first time Joel kissed her was in October, on a Sunday evening when he had stayed late to help her move some of the root cellar stores before the first hard frost came, and they were standing in the cellar doorway in the orange autumn light, and Mae had turned to say something about the potato bins, and found him looking at her with the full, honest attention that was his particular way of looking, and the thing that had been building all through the summer and the harvest and the long porch evenings was suddenly, simply present between them. She did not move away. He kissed her once softly and then drew back to see what her face said. Her face said yes, in the complete language of it, without ambiguity. He kissed her again, and the autumn light lay warm on the cellar door, and the prairie went on forever in all directions, and it was the most real thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. Clara was asleep inside. She was 12 by now, a remarkably perceptive 12, and she had been expecting something of this nature for some months. And when Joel stayed later than usual that evening and Mae came inside with a quality in her expression that Clara identified immediately, Clara said, from the doorway of her room in her nightgown, "Good night, Mr. Garrett." And Joel said, "Good night, Clara." And Clara said, "You can call me Clara without the Mr. part." And Joel said, "Good night, Clara." And Clara went to bed with complete satisfaction, carrying the small running horse in her hand. The winter in Caldwell was cold and long in the way of Kansas winters, and it arranged itself differently for two people who now knew, with full certainty, that they were in love, than it had for 7 preceding winters in which Mae Townsend had been alone with her daughter and her farm and her grief that had long since quieted into something more like character than pain. Joel came to the farm often, not always for a reason beyond company. He brought firewood when he had extra. He sat with Clara and helped her with the figures in her school lessons when she was stuck, though she was rarely stuck because she was her mother's daughter and had inherited all of the stubbornness that expressed itself as persistence. He and Mae talked by the fire in the evenings about everything and nothing, about the carpenter's work he was doing in town, and the decisions she was making about next year's planting, and the letter she had gotten from her sister in Missouri, and the news from the Wichita paper. He told her about Oklahoma Territory one evening in December, sitting by the fire while the wind moved across the prairie outside. He told her about Anna and the son who had died with her, and he told it plainly without performing grief or suppressing it, and Mae listened the way she had listened to nothing else, with the full weight of herself. When he was done, she moved from her chair to the settee where he was sitting and sat beside him, and she took his hand the way he had taken hers in the summer on the porch, and they sat by the fire in the warmth and the quiet and held the weight of each other's losses between them like something they were carrying together rather than alone. "We have both lost things," Mae said. "Yes," Joel said, "and we are both still here." "Yes." She turned to look at him. "I don't want to be alone anymore," she said, and it was the truest thing she had said perhaps in 7 years. "Not in the way I have been. I made peace with it because I had to, but I don't want it anymore." Joel looked at her in the firelight, this woman who had stood alone for 7 years and held everything together and sent away every man who came with less than she deserved, and he said, "Then don't be." It was not a proposal, not yet, and she did not take it as one. But it was the foundation of something, spoken out loud in the firelight, and they both knew it. He proposed in February, on a clear cold day when the snow lay over the prairie in a white so flat and total it made the sky seem closer than usual. He had come to the farm that morning on some pretense of looking at a broken hinge on the barn door, which was a real hinge and really broken, but that was not why he had come. He fixed the hinge, and then he stood in the barn with me and said, "I want to marry you." Mae looked at him. "Joel," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you have built this yourself and it's yours. I know you don't need me to manage anything. I know Clara has a life here and I don't want to disrupt it. I know all of that." He took a breath. "I want to marry you because I love you and because the last 8 months have been the best of my life, and because I don't want to go to bed at night knowing you're out here and I'm in town and there is space between us when there doesn't need to be." He paused. "This farm is yours. This land is yours. I'm not asking for any of that. I'm asking for you." Mae looked at him for a long moment in the winter barn with the pale cold light coming through the high window and the horses shifting in their stalls, and then she said, "Yes." Just that. Plainly and completely, the way Mae Townsend said everything she meant. He crossed the barn floor and took her face in his hands and kissed her in the winter light, and the horses were quiet and the snow was still, and outside the prairie was vast and indifferent and entirely beautiful. They told Clara that evening by the fire. They had talked about how to do this, because Clara mattered and her sense of things mattered, and there was no version of this decision that did not include her fully. Me sat with Clara on the settee, and Joel sat in the chair across from them, and me said, "Joel has asked me to marry him, and I have said yes. I wanted to tell you myself, and I want to know what you think." Clara was quiet for a moment, looking at her hands, and both adults waited with genuine patience because the waiting was real and not performative. Then Clara looked up at Joel. "Are you going to live here?" she asked. "On the farm?" "Yes," Joel said, "if that's all right with you." Clara looked at her mother and then back at Joel. "And you won't try to run things the way you don't know how?" "No," Joel said. "Your mother runs things. She runs them better than I ever could." Clara appeared to consider this with the full gravity of her 12 years. "Thomas was my father," she said. "I don't remember him very well, but I know he was a good man because Mama says so, and Mama doesn't say things she doesn't mean." "I know," Joel said. "I'm not looking for another father," Clara said. "I have one. He's just not here." She looked at Joel steadily. "But I wouldn't mind having someone who stays." The fire crackled, and outside the winter wind moved across the snow, and Joel Garrett sat across from Mae Townsend and felt something in his chest that he had been careful not to feel for a very long time. "I intend to stay," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. Clara nodded with great seriousness. "Then yes," she said. "I think it's good." Me put her arm around her daughter, and Clara leaned into her side, and they looked at Joel across the fire. And it was, in its quiet domestic way, one of the best moments any of the three of them had ever occupied. They married in April of 1885, on a Saturday, in the Caldwell Methodist Church that Me had attended for all 7 years of her widowhood. Bess Holloway cried through the whole ceremony and was not remotely embarrassed about it. Clara stood beside her mother with the small running horse in her coat pocket, and held the bridal flowers with the dignity of someone taking part in a significant event. Amos Whitfield was there, and half of Caldwell, because word had gotten around in the way that word gets around in small towns, and the town of Caldwell had, as a collective entity, something genuine invested in Mae Townsend's happiness after 7 years of watching her hold things together alone. The minister said the words, and Joel said his clearly and without flourish, and Me said hers in the steady, direct voice that was entirely hers, and the thing was done. Afterward, there was food and celebration at Bess Holloway's house, because Bess had organized it before anyone asked her to. And it was a good afternoon in the Kansas spring with the windows open, and the apple trees behind Bess's house showing their first blossoms, and the talk and laughter of people who were genuinely glad for something. Mayor Denning shook Joel's hand and told him he was lucky, and Joel said, "I know it," without any false modesty. Deputy Hicks, who had himself been one of Me's former suitors, gave them both a handshake and a generous smile, and a jug of very good apple brandy, which Me accepted with grace, and they both appreciated for the lack of bitterness in the giving of it. Clara danced with Bess's granddaughter and ate cake and showed people the cedar horse, and drew a sketch of the party in a small notebook she had brought in her coat pocket, and was completely and straightforwardly happy. Me and Joel moved through the afternoon together in the easy way of two people who have already found their rhythm, and at one point, Me looked at him across the room where he was talking with 2 of the local farmers about soil drainage, his sleeves rolled up and his hat off, and she felt the full weight of what she had chosen and the rightness of it, and she thought of Thomas, and it was not painful in the way it once had been, but gentle, like the hand of someone who has let you go gracefully. That night the farm was theirs together, and the prairie was enormous and silent around them, and the spring wind came in through the bedroom window they left cracked open, and it was the first night in 7 years that Mae Townsend went to sleep without the specific loneliness of a house where there was only one adult to hear the dark. The years that followed built their life in the way that lives are built, which is not in the grand gestures but in the accumulation of ordinary days that together constitute something extraordinary. Joel built things. He built a new work shed at the farm with proper flooring and good ventilation. He built Clara a proper drawing table for her room, sized right for her, and fitted with small drawers for her charcoal and her paper. He built cabinets for the kitchen that Mae had been making do without and shelving in the root cellar, and a proper gate on the south fence that swung true on its hinges. He built things for other people in Caldwell, too, and his reputation grew, and there was always work enough. Mae ran the farm with the capable authority she had always exercised, and now with Joel's labor available on the weekends, and in the evenings when the building work was done, the operation expanded. They added a milk cow and a proper chicken house. They planted a kitchen orchard along the south fence, 4 apple trees and 2 pear, and they talked about their first harvest from it, the way people talk about things that will take years to come and are worth waiting for. Clara bloomed in the way that happens when a child who has been quietly enduring a lack finally has what she needed without having known precisely what it was. She had had her mother always, and her mother was everything. But she had not had a home that had both kinds of presence in it, and now she did, and the shift in her was visible not as relief but as expansion, a girl with room to grow in more directions. She had Joel's steady patience when she was frustrated with something, and his habit of asking what the problem actually was before trying to solve it. She had Mae's directness and her refusal to accept things less than they could be. She drew constantly, and Joel, who had connections through the building trade to men who dealt in materials and goods, found her a set of proper drawing instruments at an estate sale in Wichita the following year, a compass and ruling pens and a good set of charcoal sticks, and she unwrapped them on her birthday with a reverence that made both adults quietly undone. In the fall of 1885, Mae told Joel she was expecting a child, standing in the kitchen with a directness that was so thoroughly hers that he laughed and then crossed the room and held her with a tenderness that had nothing awkward in it. "Are you happy?" she asked, from within the hold. "I am beyond any reasonable definition of it," he said. The baby came in May of 1886, a boy, born in the bedroom of the Townsend farm with Bess Holloway attending, and the spring rain on the roof and Clara waiting outside the door with the concentrated anxiety of a 13-year-old who cared enormously. The birth was not easy, but Mae was as she always was in hard things, present and determined, and when it was done and the boy was breathing and pink, and making the vigorous protests of someone new to existence, Joel held him with the practiced care of someone who had held a child before, but also with the particular new wonder of someone for whom this was entirely different from before. They named him Thomas William Garrett. Thomas for the first and William for Joel's father, who had been a good man in the territory before the fever took him in 1879. The name was Mae's idea, and she offered it with the same clear-eyed generosity that characterized all the things she did, and Joel received it the same way, with a fullness of feeling that was genuine and complete. Clara met her brother with the serious focus she brought to all significant things, examining his small face and his remarkable number of fingers and saying, with conviction, that he was the finest-looking creature she had seen, which was saying something because she had seen a great many horses. Thomas William Garrett grew into an energetic, curious, loud little person who followed Clara everywhere she would allow and Joel everywhere else, and who had his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's dark hair, and the combined stubbornness of both of them, which was a quantity of stubbornness that the Kansas prairie itself might have found challenging. He called Clara Cla before he could manage her full name, and she allowed this because she was a magnanimous older sister, and he called Joel Papa, with a natural ease that was simple and total, and made Joel's heart do something entirely without his permission every time. By the spring of 1888, the farm was larger and more productive than it had ever been, and Mae and Joel had found the particular working partnership of two people who respect each other's competence completely, and never confuse the division of labor with a division of worth. She ran the farm. He built and repaired and maintained. They made decisions together about the big things and trusted each other's judgment on the small ones. Clara was 15 and drawing things that were genuinely extraordinary. Landscapes and portraits, and architectural studies of the buildings going up in Caldwell, as the town continued to grow. Joel had quietly sent 3 of her drawings to a man he knew in Kansas City who was involved in publishing, and the man had written back that the girl had real talent and should be encouraged, and Joel had shown me this letter before he showed it to Clara, because that was the kind of man he was, and me had looked at the letter and looked at her husband and said, "Show her." When Clara read the letter, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, with the gravity of someone absorbing a large piece of information, "Someone in Kansas City said this." "Yes," Joel said, "a person who knows about art. A person who publishes illustrated newspapers and books, yes." Clara folded the letter with great care and put it in the cigar box with her drawings. "I'm going to draw every day," she announced. "More than I already do." "Yes," me said from the doorway. "You are." The summer of 1888 brought more good weather and a wheat crop that was the best me had managed in 10 years of running the farm, and it brought, in late August, the news that me was expecting again. She told Joel in the kitchen in the morning with Thomas on her hip examining the coffee pot with enormous interest, and Joel set down his cup and looked at her with the same look he had given her the first time, which was a look of complete and uncomplicated joy. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. Thomas, who did not know what was being discussed but knew when something important was happening, banged the coffee pot twice and said, "Again," in a tone of general agreement. Me and Joel looked at each other over their son's head and laughed in the kitchen in the morning light, and it was one of the laughs that goes all the way down, the kind that does not perform itself but simply happens because there is no other adequate response to the fullness of a life that turned out to be more than you knew how to hope for. The second child was born in March of 1889, another boy, dark-haired and quiet in the way Thomas was loud, a contemplative small person who looked at things carefully before responding to them. They named him James Henry Garrett, for no ancestor in particular, but because the name suited him in a way that became obvious almost immediately, and he grew into it with the serene certainty of a child who has been correctly named. Clara was 16 when James was born and old enough to be genuinely helpful with both boys, which she was, though she drew a clear line at sacrificing her drawing hours, which me and Joel both respected without question because they had both insisted on it. The farm had a full orchard now. Those apple and pear trees from the planting of 3 years prior had grown enough to show promise, and the cattle operation had expanded to 20 head, and me had hired 2 permanent hands who were good workers, and who understood without being told that the woman who ran the operation ran it completely, and who were paid fairly and treated with the basic respect that a decent employer offers, which was not universal in 1889, and which me considered non-negotiable. One of the hands was a young man named Samuel, who was 20 years old and had come from East Texas with nothing but a strong back and a willingness to learn, and me had taken him on because she recognized the quality of willingness when she saw it. Joel had taught him basic carpentry on the weekends when the farming work was light, because Joel believed that a man who could do more than one thing was better positioned than a man who could do only one, and Samuel turned out to have a talent for it that surprised even Joel. "You have good hands," Joel told him, one Saturday in the work shed, watching him fit a joint. "Instinct for the fit." Samuel looked at the joint he had made and then at Joel. "You think I could learn more of it?" "I think you could build anything," Joel said honestly. "It's a question of time and practice." Me had heard this from the door of the work shed, and afterward she had said to Joel, "What are you going to do about that boy?" "What do you mean?" "He's good. He deserves a proper apprenticeship, not just weekend lessons." Joel looked at her. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. They discussed it and worked it out and offered Samuel a formal arrangement. half his time on the farm and half in Joel's carpentry work, with a real wage for both and the understanding that within 3 years he would have enough skill to set up his own operation. Samuel had accepted this with the quiet composure of someone receiving something he had not entirely expected and did not take for granted, and the arrangement worked out precisely as intended. This was the kind of people Mae and Joel Garrett were, which is to say people who noticed what was fair and tried to provide it, not because it made them look good, but because they had both spent enough time on the sharp edge of difficulty to understand what it cost when someone simply saw you and helped. Clara's talent continued to grow through her teenage years into something that was no longer just talent but craft, the deliberate trained ability that talent becomes when it meets discipline. She began corresponding with the man in Kansas City about formal study, with Mae's encouragement and Joel's specific assistance in navigating the practicalities, because Kansas City was real, and the opportunity was real, and Clara's future was not something to be managed into smallness out of caution. When Clara was 18, in the summer of 1891, she went to Kansas City to study at the art school that the Kansas City man had connected her with, carrying a portfolio of drawings in a leather case that Joel had made for her specifically, fitted with a locking clasp and her initials in the leather. Mae stood at the train station in Caldwell and held her daughter for a long time before she let her go, and Clara held her back with equal fierceness. "Write every week," Mae said. "Every week," Clara promised. She shook Joel's hand with great formality and then abandoned the formality and hugged him. He hugged her back solidly, the hug of a man who had come to love a person as his own through the simple persistence of being present, which is perhaps the truest way that love is built. Thomas, age 5, stood on the platform holding James's hand and waved with a vigor that could have been seen from the next county. Clara wrote every week. She sent drawings. The drawings changed and grew in her letters, becoming more confident and more her own, and Mae read each letter at the kitchen table with the same attention she gave the things that mattered most. The years turned. Caldwell grew. Joel's carpentry business grew with it, and he took on 2 apprentices of his own in addition to Samuel, and the work was steady and satisfying. Mae's farm continued to produce, the orchard coming into full bearing by 1892 and providing them and their hired hands with apples and pears through the summer and enough to sell at market. The cattle were 30 head now. The kitchen garden was the envy of the county. Thomas grew into a boy who was loud and funny and endlessly energetic, who was a natural horseman by age 7 and a confident rider by 9, who had his mother's stubbornness and his father's capacity for precision work, which was an unusual combination that expressed itself as a child who built very complicated things and then rode his horse over them to see what happened. James was quiet and serious and read everything he could find, which in Caldwell in the 1890s was limited but sufficient for a determined reader, and Mae ordered books for him from the Wichita catalog without being asked, and Joel built him a proper bookshelf that grew in sections as the collection grew. In 1893, Mae sat Joel down at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening with the lamp lit and the boys asleep and said, "I want to tell you something." He folded his hands on the table and waited. "When Thomas died," she said, meaning her first husband, "I thought that was the whole of my life, the farm and Clara and managing. I thought everything good had already happened and the rest was just the getting through." Joel said nothing, listening. "I was wrong," she said. "I was completely wrong about that, and I want you to know that I know it." Joel looked at her across the table in the lamplight, this woman who had stood alone for 7 years and turned away everyone who came with less than she was worth and had then, when the right person arrived without any intention of courting her, had recognized what he was and let him stay. He looked at her the way he had looked at her for 9 years without calculation, just with the fullness of what she was. "Me," he said. "Let me finish," she said. "Go ahead," he said. "You came to fix a wagon axle," she said. "You didn't come for me. You didn't come with any of the things that the others came with. You just came, and then you kept coming, and you were exactly yourself every single time, and I did not know how much I needed exactly that until I had it." She paused. "I am grateful every day." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I came to fix a wagon axle," he said. "And then your daughter invited me into your barn and showed me your spare parts, and I met you. And I didn't know what I was walking into, but if I had known, I would have walked in anyway." Me looked at their joined hands on the table, and then she looked up at him. "I love you," she said. "I want to keep saying it because I spent 7 years not saying it to anyone, and I intend to make up the time." "I love you," he said back, and it was simple and total and true, without ornamentation or condition. They sat at the table until the lamp burned low and the night was deep and still outside, and the farm was quiet around them and the prairie was quiet beyond that, and it was everything. Clara came home from Kansas City in the summer of 1894, not because her studies were finished, but because she had been offered a position as an illustrator for a Kansas City newspaper, a real professional position with a real wage, and she had accepted it and come home to tell her family in person before she started. She arrived on the train with her leather portfolio and a new hat, and the bearing of someone who had gone away a girl and come back a woman, and me met her at the station, and they held each other on the platform with Thomas, now 8, making observations about Clara's new hat that Clara found very funny. Clara stayed for 3 weeks, drawing the farm and the prairie and the children and me and Joel sitting on the porch. And the drawings she made of their life in those 3 weeks were among the best things she ever made because she drew with full knowledge of what she was looking at, which was love and home, and the particular texture of a life that had been honestly built. She drew me and Joel on the porch one evening without them knowing, sitting side by side with the prairie behind them going orange in the late light, and it was a drawing that captured something true about 2 people who had come to each other late and had built something whole from it. And it was, of all the things Clara Townsend ever drew, the one she kept for herself for the rest of her life. The years continued their turning. The territory of Oklahoma became the state of Oklahoma in 1907, and Joel rode out to tell the hired hands about it with a particular quietness that me understood, because she understood him completely by then. And she let him have the moment with its complicated feelings about a place he had come from and left behind and carried forward. Thomas grew into his name, loud and capable and genuinely kind beneath the loudness, with his mother's gray-green eyes and his father's hands, and he worked the farm with me through his teenage years with the same competent authority he had apparently inherited from both of them, and showed no signs of wanting to leave, which did not surprise anyone who knew either of his parents. James went east to study at a school in St. Louis, sponsored in part by the same network of connections that Joel had cultivated through years of honest work and reliable friendship. And he went with a head full of books and came back with more of them, and a mind that had grown in the direction it was always going to grow. The farm went to Thomas eventually, as was right, and he ran it the way his mother had, which was to say with absolute competence and without apology, and he found a woman of his own, a farmer's daughter named Ruth, who had the same quality of directness that seemed to characterize the people who fit naturally into the Townsend Garrett life. Joel built the addition onto the farmhouse himself, the extra rooms needed as the family grew, and he built it with the same precision he had always brought to everything, checking every angle and setting every joint with the certainty of a man who knew that the way a thing was built was how long it would stand. Mae Townsend Garrett, who had been a widow for 7 years and had turned away 7 men, and let the 8th stay not because he was a suitor, but because he was simply himself, stood on the porch of her farm one evening in the golden autumn of 1898 and looked out at the prairie that had always been hers, and at the man who had come to be hers as well, without taking anything from her own, and at the 2 boys playing in the yard with the dog, and at the letter from Clara on the kitchen table full of news from the city and the illustration work that was making her name, and she felt something she had not known, in the dark years of the beginning, was still possible. She felt complete. Joel came and stood beside her and looked out at the same view with the same ease of a man who had found his place after years of motion and had settled into it without struggle once he found it. "Good evening," he said. "Good evening," she said. Thomas ran past yelling something at James, who was yelling something back, and the dog barked, and the prairie went pink and gold in the falling light, and Mae reached over and took Joel's hand the way she had learned to do, freely and without any of the old caution, because the caution had served its purpose and was no longer needed. He held her hand, and they stood on the porch of a farm that was alive and whole, and surrounded by the immense flat beauty of the Kansas plains, and the sun went down over the western horizon in the slow, magnificent way that Kansas sunsets do, and the stars came up one by one and then all at once, and the night was good and the life in it was good, and it was enough and more than enough, and it was theirs. Clara's letter on the kitchen table contained, near the end of its third page, a postscript that Mae had not yet read. She read it the next morning at the kitchen table with coffee. It said, "I have been thinking about you and Joel lately, about how everything happened. You turned everyone away, and then the one who wasn't trying to be there walked in anyway, and you knew. I think about that when I am trying to draw something true. You have to stop trying to construct it and let it be what it actually is. I think you figured that out before either of you knew it. I love you both very much. Come visit when the harvest is done." Mae folded the letter and set it down and picked up her coffee, and the morning light came through the kitchen window in the way Clara had drawn it, years ago, and the house was full of the sounds of a family beginning another day, and Mae Townsend Garrett sat in her kitchen and was, without qualification or remainder, at peace.